For this video, we're going to be talking about the different meat cuts. So within this lesson, we're going to learn how to buy meat at the grocery store. And then the next lesson, we're going to really talk about how to cook the individual cuts and proper cooking methods. So for this lesson, one of the big main ideas and objectives is to understand what primal cuts and then fabricated cuts are. So last lesson video, we talked about the fact that when you slaughter an animal, it needs to have the innards removed and they are set aside, and then that animal needs to hang and it needs to age a little bit. The animal is generally split into half. So as we talk about the different meat cuts, you want to think about the fact that an animal has like a left and a right side. They're symmetrical, and so generally two of each of these cuts will come off of a half. So we're going to kind of look at the animals as if we're looking at one flat half, and then there are two halves for each carcass of an animal. So we did talk last class period about the meat grading and the different grades of meat. And so prime, choice, and select are what you're going to have the most experience with, either in the grocery store or working through food service. So this is a little bit more of our vocabulary. So we talked about the fact that there are different types of animals that we eat here in American culture. Pork, which comes from the swine or pig. Lamb. Lamb is a sheep that is less than a year old. Mutton would be the meat from a sheep that is more than a year, that is not a lamb. So that's the difference between lamb and mutton. They both come from the same animal. It all depends on the age. Veal is from a cow that is less than a year old. And so beef and veal would come from the same animal. That depends on the age. So we looked a little bit last time about the structure of meat and what meat is made out of. And so some things to kind of look at right now for this particular lesson are whole carcass. So a whole carcass would be the entire animal after it has been slaughtered. This does not include the head, feet, or hide. This may include some of the organs that are removed and set to the side that are edible. We call that variety meats or a fowl. And so that would include a heart or sometimes the intestines, like in chitlins, or you could look at the liver. So these are some commonly eaten inside meats, the guts and things. Tripe, which is stomach, that's also sometimes included. So a primal cut is a big wholesale cut, and you do see these at the grocery store. This is a big primary piece of meat that is separated from the animal. This would be very, very large, and I'm going to kind of give some examples of that. A fabricated cut is a primal cut that has been broken down into menu-sized portions. And so we're going to talk about the specific examples of that as well. So when we'll start with pork. Pork is a little bit easier to kind of look at in the breakdown. So there are 5 primal cuts of pork, and you will see these at the grocery store or in food service. So there is the loin, the shoulder, or the butt. The butt is not actually from the rear. It actually does come from the front. And then there are spare ribs or the belly. And then there is the ham. So we're talking about pigs. So here's an example of these primal cuts. So when you look at the animal itself, again, you're looking at one half of it. The ham, like country ham, that's going to come from the back portion there. And then from the top portion there, you're going to look at what's called the Boston butt or the picnic shoulder. When you buy these in large form, then you do typically see them sold in big form, and that would be a primal cut. Now, the loin and the side are sometimes sold whole and sometimes broken down into fabricated cuts, which I'll show you a little bit more on the fabricated cuts. So these would be the whole primal cuts that you may or may not deal with in the store. Here would be the fabricated cuts. And so fabricated cuts are portioned size. A lot of times you'll find them at the grocery store in a package of a few, maybe 2 to 10. So you have the New York pork chop, which does come from the loin. The porterhouse pork chop, which is, we're going to talk about porterhouse with beef. So this has a little bit of the tenderloin, and it also has the New York pork chop. The ribeye pork chop, boneless or bone in, and then you have a sirloin pork chop, which is generally leaner. Also at the store, you'll see a shoulder chop, which has a lot more marbled fat within it. And just like beef, you'll see quite a bit of marbling. You can also buy these in roasts, which are going to be a little bit more closer to a primal cut. So pork tenderloin are sold whole in a package. Pork loin is also sold whole, and it's a much bigger package. And a tenderloin and a loin are a little different. The ribeye roast generally is sold bone in. It's going to be just like beef. You'll find the ribeye is a fattier, marbled cut of meat. And then a sirloin is going to be leaner. And then you also have these roast as well. And then you can get into the ribs. So the back ribs come higher off the hog, and they are a little bit more tender than the spare ribs or the St. Louis style. And then country ribs are very fatty, and they're generally cut per bone, and they have quite a bit of meat on them. You can get those boneless or bone in. And when you get into other cuts, you might get little bitty cutlets, ground pork, which is a fabricated, or you might even have pork for stew meat or for kebabs. So pork is processed by curing, smoking, or irradiation. You can pickle it, inject it, and sugar. So when you get pork, a lot of times it has been injected with sometimes just salt water, sometimes other things. You can preserve pork. We've been eating preserved pork in our history for many, many years. Some pork is leaner than others. People talk about not eating pork for health reasons. Yes, a lot of bacon, a lot of ribeye, a lot of fatty cuts of pork are definitely going to impact your cholesterol and your calorie intake, but there are a lot of leaner cuts of pork. And over the last 50 years, even how we raise pigs has changed in the United States. A lot of lard used to be used in cooking. Lard is the rendered fat of the pork. And we don't use as much of that in our culture anymore. And so 50 years ago, the pork that was farmed was short and fat to allow for that extra lard production. And now a lot of the pigs that are commercially raised are actually kind of tall and skinny. And even the meat within it has a lot less fat in it. So there's still very fatty cuts of pork, the pork belly and the bacon, the ribeyes, going to have a lot of marbling, going to have a lot of fat cap. But ultimately, there are the tenderloin, a lot of the loin, sirloin chops. These are all very lean cuts of pork, and they can be eaten quite healthily as a lean meat. So cuts of lamb. So lamb is the meat of the sheep that is less than a year old. Mutton is the meat of the sheep more than a year old. It does get kind of tough, and so typically that is just used for barbecue. Lamb and mutton it's a red meat like beef. Pork is a white meat, but as a red meat, it does have a lot different flavor. For the item, it's not really what you would refer to as gamey, but it has a different than beef flavor. So you can get the shoulder, shank or breast, rack, loin, and leg. So here is a visual here of what that looks like when you have a sheep and you slaughter it and then you cut it in half. So the leg is often sold very whole, and it's not a huge animal, so these are not huge. Loins are often cut into chops, and these look a lot like little